2009, although it has to be said, not during the pandemic. And I have also done research on human rights monitoring in immigration detention centres in Greece and in Hungary.
Yeah. So would you say you're an academic essentially, or does it go further than that? I mean, is the research in order to advise policy and guidance to governments?
No, I would say I'm an academic primarily, but I have contributed to some policy. I wrote literature reviews for both of the Shaw reviews, and I have had regular meetings with various people in the immigration detention system around my research findings over the years.
So you know your way around immigration detention here and abroad.
Yeah.
And what are your professional qualifications as such, apart from that being what you do? What qualifications do you have, degrees and that sort of thing?
I have a PhD in criminology from the University of Cambridge.
Right. Now, for the purposes of this inquiry, you've made two reports, one your original report and the other one a supplementary. The first report, chair is INQ 000064, dated the 17th of November of last year, and the second is your supplementary report of the 9th of February of this year, INQ 000123, and I'd ask for those to be adduced in full. Right, so let's, using your first report, and you should have that in front of you. Can we look at your what your instructions were for the purposes of this inquiry? And if you go to page 3, paragraph 1.6. Your letter of instruction included the provision by the inquiry of access to material originally, which included PSU, Professional Standards Unit investigation reports, the Gatwick IRC security meeting minutes, G4S policy and procedure documents, management reports, training documents and risk assessments, publicly available reports on Brook House, walk-through videos and plans of the physical environment of Brook House. Pausing there, did you visit Brook House?
I did, yeah.
And when was that?
When was that?
Roughly. Was it last year sometime?
No, it was this year.
Yeah, and the one visit, and were you shown around the whole building?
I went on the same day as Dr. Hard, and we were shown, actually not around the whole building, but to one of the housing units and to E-Wing.
You examined a number of transcripts of interviews conducted by Verita. You viewed broadcast and unbroadcast BBC footage, and you had access to IMB documentation, including board minutes, agenda, visit logs, and complaints. And since your original instruction, you produced a supplementary report. Was that based on additional material?
It was, yes.
What was the nature of the additional material you were supplied with? Do you remember?
Well, I was given some additional material from G4S, for instance, the contract that was in place at the time. I was also given some additional material from Serco, who are currently running Brook House, and I was given some additional witness statements from some of the staff members.
Yeah. And at 1.7, we don't have to list it, but there you set out the topics that you were asked to examine between the relevant period of months of April and August of 2017. You've also watched, I think, parts of the evidence which has been heard in this inquiry. I think that includes parts of the evidence of Derek Murphy, Sean Sayers, Dan Lake, Ben Saunders, Sandra Calver and Peter Needon. I think you've read parts of the transcripts of evidence from Dr. Dominic Aitken and Callum Tully, and I think more recently you viewed some of the other evidence. Can you tell us what that was?
I watched some of Dr. Hard's evidence, some of Dr. Bowie's evidence from HMIP, some of Mary Molyneux's evidence from the IMB, Jan Pascali, some of his evidence.
Okay. And in essence, if we look at paragraph 2.3 of your first report, you say, as part of this inquiry, I've been asked to examine the matter of staff culture in Brook House with a view to explaining how the evidence documented by the BBC came to occur and what might be done to prevent similar events happening again. So is that the essence, really, of what you've been asked to do and what you've sought to do? Now, I'm going to be asking you a series of questions. Can I tell you what I'm not doing, which is what you know, Professor? I'm not going to be taking you through your reports. Essentially, I'm going to be asking you a series of questions, by and large, for the most part, sought by and on behalf of the core participants in this inquiry, as well as some of my own. And from time to time, I'll attribute, but not always, those questions to individual core participants. Can I ask you to look, please, at 2.4 on page 5 of your first report, where you say the evidence I have seen suggests that there were a number of intersecting factors present in Brook House in 2017, all of which contributed to the violence and disorder evident on BBC Panorama. Some of these factors were particular to Brook House at the time. Others are inherent to the immigration detention system. Which were the factors you think which were inherent, as it were, or particular to Brook House rather than the immigration detention system more widely?
So the factors
those
just
intersecting factors you talk about.
Well, lots of the things that have already been discussed in the inquiry so far. So there were a series of quite practical issues around staffing levels and around the vulnerability and mental health problems among the detained population. There was obviously a period of quite significant security lapses, so the presence of spice in the Immigration Removal Centre. And then it seems fairly clear that there was considerable staff behaviour around that, that had gone unchecked, and that was particularly evident in the footage that I saw from E-Wing, but that seemed to be distributed around the detention centre, which led to various forms of racist behaviours and also a lot of sexism and misogyny and at the very sort of basic level, extremely aggressive language and mannerisms towards the detained population.
Yeah. I mean, in your report at 2.5 on page 6, you say some factors were more evident in certain parts of the Immigration Removal Centre. You're talking there about Brook House, especially on E-Wing than elsewhere. So, first of all, do you think E-Wing was a particular focus of problem?
So obviously one of the difficulties with coming to conclusions about what was happening is that that the footage was mediated through Mr. Callum Tully. So we are, the main sort of primary evidence about what happened was gathered by him, and so I'm entirely dependent on when he turned his camera on and off, and he clearly turned his camera on quite a lot when he was on E-Wing. So I think that that has to be acknowledged. But on the other hand, I think there are other structural reasons to think that E-Wing is likely to be a place where there would have been those difficulties because of the nature of E-Wing in the institution. And by that I mean the way in which E-Wing was used at the time for men who were suicidal, who were put on constant watch, for men who had had a medical emergency, often seemingly around drug use, for men who were considered to be recalcitrant, who'd been in fights, for men who were facing an early removal from the centre, who they wanted to take out of a normal housing unit, and also for men who were otherwise just considered to need a little bit more attention. And so the mix of all of those people made E-Wing a very difficult part of the centre. And then E-Wing physically is located quite separately from the centre. So although there is a door opposite it in the corridor, that door is not, which goes into another housing unit, that door is not normally used. So the entrance to the housing unit is on the floor above. So all of those factors together meant that it was a complicated place which was out of sight.
Yeah. So that's one of the first factors you mentioned, which impressed you, as it were, in terms of the conclusions you arrive at. Secondly, at 2.6, you talk about significant questions about the relationship between care, trust and security in Brook House, and about the extent to which staff in Brook House treated detained people with dignity or decency. What's the focus of attention there? What are you telling us in that paragraph?
So there, I'm talking about a number of different aspects, really. So one of the points I'm trying to make there is around the language use that's evident in a lot of the footage. So the sort of, I was quite shocked by the level of language and the amount of swearing and the kind of clear frustration that officers were expressing to one another about the detained population and also about their colleagues and particularly about their senior colleagues. So that seemed to be, that all of that seemed to me to be an indication that there wasn't, much trust in the institution in any direction. And I think that the other factor that was, again, quite shocking to me about the footage was the extent of the drug problem. So the sort of number of times that the footage showed people having medical emergencies as a result of having taken spice. And so that just showed that one of the very basic aspects of the institution had failed, which was to provide a secure institution. And together, I think that those two factors really made it very difficult for officers to care, so to sort of execute one of their key roles, which is actually to look after the people who are in their care and who have had their liberty taken away. And any institution, any custodial institution, has to keep those three elements in balance. And I think in Brook House, it was evident that they had fallen out of balance. And once they don't work, then I think you see what happens, which is that it becomes very, very difficult for people to recognise one another, whether that's a colleague or a detained person, as somebody who they will treat with dignity or decency.
Yeah. At 2.7, perhaps, which is part of 2.6, you say the evidence suggests the centre wasn't always sufficiently safe or secure. In terms of safety, are you talking just about spice problems or other problems generally?
I'm mainly talking about spice there. I think, there seemed to be some evidence of, some altercations among the detained population. I think that happens in institutions like Brook House and happens in Brook House, at other times. Obviously, there is the second level of safety, which was where the officers, were the detained people safe from the officers, and I guess some of the footage shows that they were not always safe from the officers.
Yeah. And then you, at 2.9, you deal with the, as you call it, the more mundane workplace matters like shift patterns, pay, career progression, professional development, staff recruitment and systems of oversight, as well as the material conditions and layout of Brook House, which also shape their views and practices. There's quite a lot in there. But first of all, you call it mundane, but do they have, these issues, contributory if not causative effects on the way people behave within their environment?
Yes. No, I think they clearly do, and I think that's one of the challenges about talking about staff culture, which is obviously what I was asked to do, is that staff culture is both refers to people's beliefs and values and behaviours, but it does also connect with structures and practices, and those structures and practices are sort of they're baked into the system. And so one of the points that I try and make in both of the reports is that, in an institution like Brook House, where the workers, the DCOs, are paid very poorly and have long shift patterns, and are doing work that is by and large not particularly interesting and is also not particularly valued, I think that, that is going to contribute to their view of themselves, to their view of the detained population, to their view of their senior officers, all of the rest of it. And so perhaps I shouldn't have called it mundane, perhaps that diminishes the significance, but they're the practical elements which any institution has: shift patterns, pay, career progression, and I think they are factors that need attention.
Yeah. And you conclude that particular sentence of that particular paragraph, 2.9, by saying, as well as the material conditions and layout of Brook House also shaped their views and practices. What do you mean by that?
So there I am referring to the design of the building. That Brook House, as I'm sure we all know by now, is built to a Category B prison design. So it's built really as a high security prison. This means that the detained people are held in cells behind metal doors. Brook House, when it's not necessarily at the moment because it doesn't have very many people in it, but normally and certainly at this period of time, it's extremely noisy. There's a lot of banging of doors, there's a lot of yelling, there's a lot of just sort of the environment is very stressful. And it's laid out like a prison, and so that means that there are corridors, there are little rooms where you can be sort of out of sight. All of that can lead to behaviour which can sort of go unchecked, and I think that is partly what seems to have happened on E-Wing.
So that we're clear, because there are differing views, certain people, we may have some evidence about it this week, say that the physical environment of Brook House did not in any way cause or contribute to the mistreatment of detainees. What's your position on that?
Well, I think it's quite clear that it did, and I think it's quite clear that it did affect the treatment of detainees, because I think what it does is if you lock people up in a building that looks like a prison, you tell those people and the people who are looking after them that they are criminals, and so then there's a sort of symbolism to it, which I think in Brook House there's a lot of evidence to show that kind of symbolism was reinforced in the training materials, in the language that people were using. It's also reinforced by the fact that there are some people in Brook House at any given time who have served a criminal sentence in a prison, so they get kind of bundled together in explanations for who the detained population are. And I think that, I refer to it in my report as prisonization, this idea that the custody officers were actually working in an institution that was effectively a prison with people who were therefore criminal and dangerous.
Yeah. Well, we'll come back to that term in a moment. So that those are the factors which were peculiar to Brook House, which your report builds on. From 2.10 onwards, I think you deal with you say you can't really consider Brook House without looking at the wider system, and I will, although it's, as you appreciate, outside the remit of this inquiry, and indeed yours, but nonetheless, I think you would like to express to the inquiry these wider issues, and so I'm not going to stop you, and it's only fair because you said that there are intersecting factors, not just peculiar to Brook House, but the wider system more generally. So at 2.10, you deal with issues of, right at the bottom of the text on page 6, some men appear to be fearful, others are angry or aggressive, some cry, others are suicidal. And you say on the next page, there appear to be people present suffering acute physical and mental health problems. Are you saying that's a problem of the wider immigration system, not just at Brook House? It was evident at Brook House. Because what you were picking up on is Callum Tully's filming.
Yes, I mean, I think if you were to have gone into any immigration removal centre at that period of time, you would have found people who had many of those same qualities because of the nature of the immigration removal centre. And so, you know, what a lot of academic evidence has found, and also, you know, reports from civil society organisations, and it's is that the lack of a time limit in the British immigration system creates an enormous amount of anxiety for people who are detained, which affects their mental health, and that their mental health deteriorates for the longer that they are detained. And so in a place like Brook House, and in Brook House specifically at the time, I think that was evident in the footage, in the kind of just levels of distress that were evident. But I would expect to find those levels of distress in all detention centres.
Which is, as far as you're concerned, nothing new, because you said exactly that, if my memory serves me, in Appendix 5 of the Shaw Report.
That's right.
Yeah. The Shaw Report of January 2016, that is. The second issue, more general issue that you point out at 211, which is evident from the footage, is detained men struggling to communicate with staff and lacking basic English skills. Now, of itself, perhaps, with foreign nationals, not altogether surprising, but what's the impact of that on a detained population with staff who are holding them?
Well, I think it's another key contributing factor to the anxiety and frustration of the detained population. And I think it's not too hard to imagine, you know, if I was placed in a custodial facility that looked like a prison and I couldn't communicate with anybody, I think it would be terrifying. And I think, you know, it's an enduring problem for immigration removal centres. Some immigration removal centres, I think, have tried to hire officers who speak multiple languages, and Brook House was at the time not among those centres. That then puts a lot of pressure on those officers to sort of act as conduits of translation. Every immigration removal centre obviously has access to telephone translating systems, but they don't, I think, always use them, and they're not unproblematic themselves. In the footage, there were a lot of moments where it seemed clear that there was a big communication gap, and there were a few moments where officers tried to bridge it. So there were at least 2 occasions where they were looking for dictionaries and they tried to translate with the men, but of course the men aren't always literate. So on at least one occasion, which I mentioned in one of the reports, they were trying to communicate with, I think he was a Chinese man. They found the word in the dictionary and then he couldn't read anyway. So, I mean, all of that just, I think, clearly makes it a very difficult place.
You talk about at 2.12 the case where officers question whether one young man should have been detained at all because they were concerned about his age. Was that the young man who's shown on film who they thought was either 14, which we're aware of? And you say on another occasion, officers appear to be concerned about the detention of an elderly man. Again, these are Brook House instances, but presumably you would tell us that these kind of problems arise across the whole estate.
Yes.
And then at 2:13, you tell us that the documents and the video footage mention common immigration problems that the detained population faced in 2017. Flights are cancelled when people wish to leave, others forced to go without sufficient time to manage their case in the UK or to say goodbye, others moved around the system far from family members, or having simply been living in Brook House for many months are unsure what's happening in their case. So again, that's a common problem, although evidenced, as we see from the BBC programme. Now, at 2:15, over the page 8 of your first report, you say that there are 3 pieces of footage which are instructive in thinking about staff culture in Brook House in 2017. And can you just take us through them, please? What was the first that you felt was instructive and why? So we're focusing on staff culture.
Yes.
And you said that there were these 3 pieces of footage which clearly impressed you as being perhaps symptomatic of the staff culture that was there at the time?
So the first is with D1527, which obviously appeared on the Panorama show.
And just remind us, this was the incident of which there were several key incidents, if you like, on the 25th of April, but ending up in Jan Pashkali straddling the head of that detained man and putting his hands around his throat. That's what
right.
you're thinking about.
That's
yeah.
right. And so in the report, what I refer to here is not actually that particular moment of the restraint, but is before that, where the man is calling out for help. And I think the reason I selected that example is that I think it's very important that we hear the words of the detained population. And I mean, so he's making demands and he's saying that he's asked nicely for everything. And he challenges the officers and he says, you know, no one's helped, I've asked nicely with respect, why are you talking to me roughly like this? And so he is making his own claim there, where he's basically saying, you know, I needed something and you didn't help me. And the officers don't respond, they stay silent, and then they yell at him, and then the restraint happens. And so I sort of chose that example as a moment where you can see somebody being incredibly upset and making requests, and the only way the officers respond to him is by being aggressive and violent. The next example is on E-Wing again, and it's a different person. And that man...
Can we just fix the date? It's the 30th of July.
The 30th of July.
Yeah.
And that man screams and screams. I mean, so I take, you know, I quote from him, but and I quote from him again so that we can actually, you know, hear what he had to say. But he's screaming for a very long time. And is actually, I mean, when I watched it, it's very confronting to watch. And it must have been extremely... distressing for him, and it was obviously distressing for anybody who was in E-Wing at the time. And officers are totally silent. And again, he makes demands. So his demands were about his immigration documents, and he seems to be suggesting in his quote that he wants to know what's going on with his immigration case. And we know from all sorts of evidence that that's a very common frustration for people in detention, that they don't know what's happening in their immigration case. And yet, in that moment of him screaming and screaming, nobody goes to get the Home Office. Nobody tries to respond to that, because that's quite a practical concern. Instead, they just sit there totally silently. And they're, to be fair to them, they're doing what they're meant to do. So he was obviously on constant watch for suicide, because an officer is there staring at him, writing notes. But there's no interpersonal interaction of any sort. And I think it's a bit hard to imagine another situation where if somebody was so distressed that they were screaming for some minutes that another human wouldn't reach out and say something. So I was struck by their silence. So in the first example with D1527, the officers act and are aggressive, and then they're physical. In the second example, they're just totally silent.
And there's a third clip you deal with, your paragraph 2.17, which you say offers one officer's view of what it felt like to work in the environment and the potential impact that being exposed to trauma and distress can have on staff.
Mm-hmm.
And this is about an officer by the name of Aaron Stokes. Tell us about that, please.
And so Mr. Stokes and Mr. Talia just having a conversation. I think it was in the visits hall, and in that conversation, Mr. Stokes, you know, explicitly says that he feels mentally drained from his job, from looking after the detained population. But so he begins, and I think with this acknowledgement, which is important also for the inquiry to take seriously that it is mentally draining. But then he moves almost immediately into quite derogatory language. So he doesn't say it's mentally draining. I'm mentally drained from trying to look after these people. He says I'm mentally drained from trying to look after these nutters. And then he turns, and then he goes into more detail about suicide, people threatening to take their own lives. And he tells Mr. Tully that he doesn't care and that, he just wishes they'd get on with it. And my interpretation of that conversation was that Mr. Stokes was raising an important issue, which is that I'm sure it is incredibly difficult to work in an environment where people are so distressed. But then he clearly can't manage it. So he then moves into this way of conceiving of them, which is dehumanizing and which I would say creates a kind of emotional barrier between him and them, which will then make it very hard to actually meaningfully care and try to assist. So I chose that example because I think it shows how even when not faced with somebody screaming at them, that officers were clearly talking about what it felt like to one another and sort of talking about it in language which I'm sure was an emotional response, but which effectively dehumanized the detained population.
I mean, the problem you seem to be identifying is one where these officers were ill-equipped to deal with the people that they were supposed to be caring for.
Yes, I think they were ill-equipped, but I suppose I also think I'm not really convinced that you could equip somebody adequately to deal with that.
One of the questions which has been asked of many, and the evidence given in response by many, is we had no mental health training. And the stock answer was, I'm not a psychologist, I don't know how to deal with these people. They clearly had no mental health training at all. Do you think that would have made a difference if there was, if DCOs, when they had part of their initial training course, were given assistance in how to deal with the nature of the population or some of the population they were expected to deal with, or not? Or do you think that's just for the type of people who become DCOs and their expectations of the job that they have, do you think that just wouldn't make a difference to culture and, for example, speaking about mentally disturbed or ill people as nutters?
I mean, I think that's a very difficult question because I think it's clear that the training of DCOs is. It seems to me that it's inadequate, and that it's inadequate for a series of reasons. One of which is that it's fairly minimal and it's pretty much focused on security. So yes, I think having more training, more advanced training, better training on mental health issues could be, could assist. And I think, however, I think it's important to imagine making these reforms because I guess we have to try and figure out how to prevent this from happening again. But, I do say in the report, and I know this is totally outside the terms of reference, I think the only way you could really completely mitigate this would be to not use a custodial environment for managing people's immigration cases. And given that most immigration cases are in fact handled in the community, I think that is a perfectly reasonable goal to be pursuing. So, and then all the other things which are meant to be happening and which were meant to be happening at the time in terms of diverting people who are particularly vulnerable, that should also be in place.
You're talking about the proper operation of Rule 35, for example.
Yeah, and just the adults at risk policy in general.
Yeah. But while we do have the Brook houses, and coming back to my original question, do you think it's an answer at all to have better training, or do you think that the nature of the staff culture that we saw in Brook House, and Brook House is not unique, there have been several reports over the years of this kind of behaviour in similar institutions, do you think better mental health training would even touch the sides, or is it a complete waste of time?
No, I think it would be helpful. I mean, I think the other thing that would be good to invest in would be some kind of secondary trauma training for DCOs. I mean, I mention it in I think both of the reports that there have been attempts made in the prison service to do secondary trauma training for officers, for prison officers.
And what do you mean by secondary trauma?
So secondary trauma is, what happens if you are confronted often with other people's trauma. And so, so if you're an officer and if you're a detainee custody officer and you are hearing a lot from the people in your care about their experiences, if they're asylum seekers, for instance, or if they have PTSD, or if you're dealing with a lot of distress, you are ultimately affected by that distress. And what secondary trauma counselling can do is it can try and give officers tools for acknowledging that they are feeling distress themselves because they're hearing about other people's distress, and give them tools for recognising it and for recognising the effects of secondary trauma, because the effects of secondary trauma are things like dehumanization, aggression, losing control of your own emotions, things like that. And so, I think there is scope for doing more with staff, but I'm not convinced that would eradicate the problem.
I mean, in the end, how do you teach anyone empathy?
Well, I mean, I think that, again, much as I have reservations about constantly comparing IRCs to prisons, the prison service did a lot to try and address some of these issues through the decency agenda. And the decency agenda, as I mentioned in the report, started with a very basic question which to officers, which was, would you feel happy if a family member was locked up in this prison? And I think that can go some way towards encouraging empathy, because I cannot imagine that somebody working in Brook House in the relevant period, if they were asked that question, would have answered yes. So I think, and the other point to make, I suppose, is that some officers do have empathy. We are concentrating on particular individuals who didn't, and who clearly did things that they really shouldn't have. But there are some officers who appear concerned in the footage, the examples that I gave before about people looking for dictionaries, people being worried about the old man who was locked up and worried about the young man who was locked up. I mean, it's not a totally empathy-free institution.
Okay, Callum Tully, as you may recall, says that himself, that they weren't all bad apples.
Mm-hmm.
And you think that's a fair comment?
Yeah. Yes.
Right, well, having had that overview, can we come back to the question which you pose yourself, actually? If you go to your page 11, under your heading Staff Culture, what is it and what do we know about it? You say it's difficult to define. What is it about staff culture that makes it difficult to define, and why does it matter?
Well, I think it matters because people refer to staff culture all the time without necessarily having an agreed definition. Yeah. I think there's a whole lot of academic literature about workplace culture or institutional culture or staff culture in a range of different places, and it normally centres on a kind of group of issues around behaviours, attitudes, values. And then sometimes also questions around sort of material or symbolic representation. So, I don't think this was necessarily, well, maybe it was the case of Brook House, how people dress, things like that. So, and the way Stephen Shaw defined it in 2018 is this idea that how organisations do things, most commonly described as how we do things around here. So that's, all of that's still a bit fuzzy about what that actually might mean in practice. And I think there's two risks about talking about staff culture. One is to talk about it in the singular, because I imagine that there was probably more than one staff culture at the time at Brook House. We're concentrating in the inquiry on a particular version. And then the other risk, as I've sort of already hinted at is that if we talk about culture, we mustn't forget about structure. And so, you know, I think we always have to remember that this institution is you know, set up with a specific purpose, which is to facilitate the removal of foreign national people who've got no, you know, exhausted their immigration case. And also we need to keep in mind all of the sort of work-based things that I mentioned before around pay and conditions and those things, you know, don't necessarily fit into behaviours and attitudes, but they shape them.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure Brook House had a mission statement, but Steve Skitt told us that G4S had certain values, one of which was integrity. There were about 3 or 4, and I can't remember the others, but he told us about them in evidence. Do they have any value at all?
I think that's quite. I mean, that's quite a political question to ask, really. I mean, certainly all institutions set out values and mission statements, and that's, you know, that's part of new public management. And I suspect the Centre for Criminology at Oxford probably has one as well. I mean, the challenge would be to try and figure out how you could communicate values and measure them and be sure that people are buying into them. And I mean, certainly immigration removal centres, and in this Brook House is no different to everywhere else. You know, you walk into one, and when you go through the staff entrance or the visitors entrance, there are big signs on the wall with the values and the mission statements of the company. I mean, I suppose the events shown in Panorama make it clear that those values were not necessarily being upheld.
Which would rather suggest that there was a failure of communication or a failure of understanding what they meant and that they ought to be translated into practice.
Yes.
No. At your 3.7 onwards on page 13, you talk about a useful starting point for understanding the events of 2017 at Brook House and for thinking about how to avoid repeat similar occurrences there or elsewhere. One of the problems being that those who work at IRCs often compare themselves to prison officers and the institutions in which they work to prisons, as do some of those who are detained. Tell us about that. What's the fundamental problem there? It may be obvious, but talk us through it.
So, in the British system, the prison service has seems to have provided the model for in the kind of government policy about how to manage foreign national citizens who've you know, exhausted their immigration case. That's not inevitable, and not all countries base their response to immigration issues on prisons. And in the immigration removal system, you see this kind of connection, you know, first of all in the architecture of the buildings, but also in the senior staff. So all centre managers, pretty much, centre directors have worked in the prison service, whether that's the public sector or the private sector, and many of the members of the SMT, the senior management team, will have as well. And I think, and then in this particular instance, a lot of the training was taken directly from the prison service itself. And I think the problem is that these are not prisons. These are not places which are designed with the purpose of either rehabilitation or punishment or deterrence. They're not places where people are serving a sentence. Most people are in fact not even ex-offenders. Certainly at the time, that was the case. And so this kind of reliance on the prison as the model for an immigration removal centre, I think, has really taken people down a pathway which leads towards thinking about these places as punitive places and places for criminals. And there's no real reason for that.
You, in 3.8, you talk about prisons operating softer forms of coercion in an incentives and earned privileges scheme, alongside a wider selection of paid work and treatment options. Is it a problem, do you think, for Brook House and other similar immigration removal centres that such schemes are not operated? We know that certain detainees could work for a small amount of money, but they volunteered for it. They couldn't be compelled to do it. Do you think that's an issue?
So I think that the difficulty is that if you are going to lock people up for an indeterminate period of time, you then need to make sure they have stuff to do to pass the time. And we know that this particular population is vulnerable and has quite complicated needs. And one of the difficulties about locking them up in an institution that looks like a prison is that the options for them to pass their time are going to be very limited. And so, paid work will be one of the very few options that they could do, and it'll be the kind of paid work that people do in prison. So it'll be cleaning and, what else do they do? Painting. Just sort of housekeeping duties around the institution. Clearly, there are ethical and I think also legal questions around coercing people to do that if they are there just by virtue of their immigration status. There are also, I would suggest, similar ethical and legal questions about getting people to work in prisons. But people do need to have something to do, because one of the real sort of problems in a detention centre is that nobody knows how long they'll be there for, and it's very debilitating to just not have any way of passing your time and anything to do.
One of the things we heard is, albeit it was designed to be a short-term holding facility, and at the same time built to a Category B prison specification, because of the short-term policy, or at least that was the underlying idea behind it, although it hasn't worked out that way. Outside spaces were not built. Does that make a difference, given what you're telling us? In other words, that there's not sufficient outside space for activity, fresh air?
Yes, I think it's very strange that Brook House was supposedly built just to hold people for 72 hours, because I don't really understand why you'd build a Category B prison to hold somebody for 72 hours. It's very expensive. And there were other Category B establishments at the time, which I think Holmbrook was always a Category B establishment, and it was not designed to hold people for 72 hours. So, I know that it's on record saying that it was built for that purpose with that idea, but it seems a strange expenditure of public funds. And the Category B design, comes with a couple of concrete yards, and there's not enough space. Brook House is right next to the runway at Gatwick, so it's extremely noisy. You hear the planes landing and taking off all the time. It's a very, very harsh environment to be in.
Let's move on, please, to your 311, where you talk about the barriers which detained men face in an IRC like Brook House. What are the barriers you have in mind?
So here I'm talking about one. In the academic literature on prisons, there's been a lot of work done there's been more work done about the role of prison officers and how important they are to not just the kind of good order and discipline of a prison, but also to the sort of decent running of an establishment. And there the sort of received wisdom is that it's very important for officers to be able to build meaningful relationships with prisoners, and they kind of set out various ways that they can do that. And so the prison officer is seen to be somebody who can play an important role in an incarcerated person's experience of the prison. And I am just pointing out here that a lot of those sort of goals are really almost impossible to achieve in a detention centre because of the lack of clarity about the duration of somebody's time in a detention centre. So, it's not uncommon that somebody might do their shift 1 week and have spent quite a lot of time trying to help an individual, and then they go back and the man has, been released, moved or deported. And so there was no warning, and they didn't know that would happen, and that just would cut any attempt to sort of invest in building a relationship with somebody. Then there's the effect of the very high levels of anxiety and distress and mental health problems. And then there's the sort of practical things around language. And I mean, it is the case that a lot of people in detention don't speak very good English, because they're, why would they? And officers don't speak much other than English. So that those make it very hard to actually have a human sort of relationship with somebody else.
Yeah, you talk in 3.12 about finding that in their day-to-day work, officers end up relying on other proxies, including race and national stereotypes. What are you saying there?
So here I'm talking about how I suppose I'm basically talking about racism, but I think. I've certainly seen this in my research, and it was evident in the material that I read and watched for the inquiry that in a circumstance where the officers find it very hard to actually have a meaningful interaction with people, then what they often rely on are just views that they would already have about the national group, and so you sort of see this in generalized comments about particular nationalities, which I think so. And I think that's the predominant form that racism takes in IRCs. It's not that often, at least in my experience, it hasn't been that often that people will necessarily use a racial epithet in a discussion with a detained person, because most people know that that's not on. But what they will do is that they will kind of generalize about all Albanians are like this, all Jamaicans are like that. And that view, I think, makes it very hard for them to, that view is racist, but also that view makes it very hard for them to actually deal with the person in front of them as an individual. And I think that is an inevitable part of an immigration removal centre. So you can and we should hold individuals to account. But if we have an institution that is designed to hold foreign nationals for the purpose of removing them, what we're doing as a society is we're saying these nationalities are people we don't want, and you put them in a prison, a place that looks like a prison, you're saying these nationalities are dangerous, these nationalities are criminal. And so I think that officers are in a way just responding to the prompts that the institution is giving them, and then they use that they kind of rely on that to try and make sense of their job, and also to manage the people in their care.
And you say at your 3.13 that such matters were evident at Brook House in 2017, and you quote from the initial training course manuals, quote, "Be friendly but not friends. Check things out, keep your emotions under control," end quote. And you say in response, top of your page 15, in response, staff deployed concepts more commonly associated with counter-terrorism, such as conditioning, in discussions of their interactions with those who are detained. So is this part of prisonization of the place?
Yes. Although it is. Although I think in a prison I think there are formal roles in prisons which encourage more of a human interaction with between officers and prisoners. And so prisons, for instance, have designated officers who are supposed to build a relationship with somebody who's incarcerated and help them through their sentence plan and talk to them about what they want to do when they're released. And so there's a kind of formal role, which used to be called a personal officer. I think it's now called something different. That role doesn't really exist in an immigration removal centre. Occasionally, and I think even in Brook House, they try and bring in a role a bit like that. But it's fundamentally difficult to do if what the purpose of your institution is to just get somebody to leave the country. I think the use of counter-terrorism language around conditioning, or even the terminology of security incidents reports, I think that is also present in prisons. I think in a removal centre that sort of language does quite a lot of damage because it elides populations that are actually really distinct, but which are easy to push together because of nationality actually, and also sometimes because of racism. So one of the quotes that I refer to in the report is around they were talking about a guy from Iraq who was on E-wing, and then they refer to him as a terrorist like in some film. And so I think there's a way in which it becomes very easy to move from national stereotypes to sort of fears around terrorism, which then, of course, just distance the population.
Yeah. I'm asked to ask you some questions on behalf of the detained persons, core participants. And the question is its open-ended nature and the lack of effective safeguards relevant? I mean, I think you've probably answered that already. But they point to the fact that it's executive detention with no statutory criteria, no time limit, in contrast with detention, for example, by police or remand in custody or pursuant to conviction and sentence. And secondly, it's designed for the purpose of facilitating removal of foreign nationals as a measure of last resort when facing imminent removal, but in practice it's for prolonged periods and is experienced by detained staff, persons and staff as indefinite. Again, themes which you've already touched on. And the questions arising out of that I'm asked to ask you is how or in what ways do you consider that the indefinite nature of detention impacted on the staff culture and their attitudes to detainees? So that's the first question.
So certainly the indefinite, the lack of clarity about the duration of detention has been shown by, a lot of evidence to be a defining characteristic of these places and to contribute to a lot of the difficulties for the detained population. It's very closely connected to the detained population's anxiety and distress and mental health problems. I think the way in which it affects staff is actually I think it affects staff because it makes their role a little bit unclear. So because if you don't really know how long somebody's there for, I mean, I've said some of this already, if you don't know how long somebody's there for, it's hard to motivate yourself to sort of invest in them as a person because they might be gone tomorrow, so why bother? It also, I think, raises questions about the purpose of your job. So if you're only going to have somebody with you for a week, then is your job actually more than just kind of giving them breakfast and lunch? If you knew that they were going to be there for 3 months, then you might sort of work with them around, having paid work or making contact with their children or whatever. So I think it draws into question what the staff's role is, and I think those questions about what the staff's actual role is, I think that does affect staff culture, because I think it's always important for all of us who have jobs to tell us, we all tell ourselves a story about what our role is, and that helps us make sense of our job. It also helps us make sense of ourselves, and it helps us do our job. And I think that for officers, the lack of clarity about the duration that anybody's going to be in their care makes it pretty easy for them to not care, because they just don't know how long they're going to be there for.
Yeah. I mean, you say in your 3.12, when asked about their relationships with those who are detained, staff worry about the appropriate line between sympathy and empathy. How close should they get? And you say the confusion is amplified by the secure environment in which they are taught to think of the detained population as potential threats. And the question arising from that is, what does that mean for the clarity of purpose and expectations of staff? In other words, how do you avoid that confusion which you've identified?
So I think it's difficult. I mean, I suppose that the response would be that there are staff who manage to care, and there are. I mean, I've in my years of doing research, I have come across officers who go the extra mile and who do try and assist people who are detained. And I think some of the people who've given evidence to the inquiry from the welfare section, Mr. Owen Syred, for instance. I mean, he seemed to refer to his work as a job which he could actually recognise its importance, and that his job was partly to care about the detained population. So I think that there are examples of this being possible, and so then the question would be, can you somehow extend from those people to include a wider group of the staff? And I think that would have to happen by a much more detailed discussion about what the role involves.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, let's move on. Going back, but we don't really have to, paragraphs 2.18 and 2.19, you talk about desensitization. In a sentence or two, what does that mean? Your page 9. Paragraph 2.18 and 2.19, you talk about coming back to Aaron Stokes. Do you remember the example?
Yeah.
The third of the 3 instructive clips, and what he was saying about how he was not coping really with the people he was supposed to be caring for. You say, suggest he has become desensitized to their distress. Mm-hmm. And then at 2.19, in your conclusion and preliminary recommendations, the first paragraph of which you say that we catch a glimpse of the impact of detention not only on those who are detained but also on those who work within Brook House. While not all of those who were detained at the time were as distressed, as the men in the clips mentioned above, nor were all of the officers as cynical or desensitized as the man in the visits hall. That's Aaron Stokes. So tell us about desensitization.
So I think that the evidence seems to suggest that one of the main ways in which officers, I think I would say, cope with their job, but maybe that's being a bit too generous. But I think that the main way in which officers respond to the challenges of their job is to create an emotional barrier, an emotional distance between themselves and the detained population. And I think that this ends up leading them, the danger is it ends up leading them towards not really appreciating the difficulties that the detained population are actually facing, and seeing that when people are angry or distressed or frustrated, they see that as just them being difficult rather than them actually being people in need and in crisis. And I think the point partly is that, especially when you see the footage at the time when there was all of this drug use, not enough staff, an overcrowd, an institution that had extra beds, all the rest of it, I think it's probably a bit hard to imagine how officers wouldn't have had to have distanced themselves a bit. Like, I think the emotional toll of working in this environment is quite high, and particularly, with these long shifts and all the rest of it. So desensitization is, in a way, an inevitable consequence of the nature of the institution.
We have examples of some of the officers themselves, when they've given evidence to the inquiry, talking about desensitization. Jan Pashali, for example, who gave evidence on the 24th of February, said that staff were exposed to many difficult situations over and over, and when you become desensitized, silly comments are made. So that was his take on it. Nathan Ring said the use of language which was attributed to him is a coping mechanism. And he said if you were not desensitised when he gave evidence on the 25th of February, it would affect your mental health, in other words, his. Dan Small gave evidence on the 28th of February. He said experienced officers told him that self-harm was widely interpreted as an attempt to stop deportation rather than being a symptom of poor mental health, and he, as he put it, cottoned on to it. And he agreed a little later when he gave evidence that maybe he was just desensitised to the situation. And then Dr. Dominic Aitken, who gave evidence in the first phase of this inquiry on the 8th of December, said many members of staff, you'll remember he interviewed a number of people when he was in the establishment, many members of staff had said that they became desensitised to seeing someone who'd injured themselves, that it shocked them the first time they saw it, and particularly severe cases would get to them. So those are just a few examples that have been plucked from the evidence. What do you think it is about the IRC environment specifically that lends itself to this desensitisation? I mean, it's maybe called a culture of desensitisation or a factor, but it doesn't really matter how you characterise it. But what do you think it is about the IRC establishment that lends itself to it?
Well, I mean, I think when the population is as distressed and vulnerable as it seems to have been the case at the time, I think that the difficulty for the custody officers is that they don't have the answer to the problems of the population. So that the real problems for the people who are detained rest in the hands of the immigration officers. That it's about their immigration case, and that custody officers can't do anything about that. That's not in their gift. So they are faced with people who, nobody wants to be in detention. While some of the people who are in detention may be okay with going back to their country of nationality, most people are not. Many of the people who are detained will have, we see that from the evidence, from the academic evidence, that people's mental health declines over time. So they're a complex population who have a lot of difficult needs, which the officers have almost no tools to actually meet. And so I think on that level, separating yourself emotionally from that is presumably the very easiest way to manage it. That if you went into work every single day and were confronted with people who were making demands that you couldn't resolve, if you cared about each and every one of them, you would feel very, very distressed. And so I think that it's a sort of bid, not necessarily conscious, but it's a bid to not kind of feel these feelings of other people. It's also, I think, amplified by the security talk and the around people who are detained. And around the buildings, and it is obviously also shaped by kind of racial stereotypes. So it's a lot easier to be desensitized towards people who you kind of think are not like you and you don't value.
Is it the same in the prison context? And if not, why not?
Well, I think there are similarities in the prison context, and I haven't done research in the prison context for a long time. It was where I began my research. But there's the literature on staff culture in prisons generally divides up officers into different kinds of types. So they kind of construct typologies, and one of the types is normally referred to as a traditional prison officer, and traditional prison officers are kind of probably analogous to some of the men who've given evidence here, people like Derek Murphy and Jan Pascali, they are authoritarian. They're more likely to be physically aggressive and to be unsympathetic towards the people in their care. I think the difference for prisons is that there are much clearer purposes of the prison, and they're not just instrumental purposes. There's a kind of moral narrative around them. So, the prison is both a place that you put somebody because they've committed a crime, but it's also meant to prevent them from, you're meant to work with them while they're there so that they don't do it again. Whether that happens is a totally separate question. There is no such moral narrative about immigration removal centres. The only moral narrative about immigration removal centres is either the kind of security one, which is that these are potentially dangerous foreigners who we need to get rid of, or it's a kind of, I think it is perhaps a moral narrative, that they don't deserve to be here, that they didn't do all the right things, and therefore we owe them nothing. So the only stories you can really tell about an immigration removal centre and its purpose are actually don't have much of a role there for staff to do anything meaningful with the detainees while they're in their care.
Right. Does the fact that many of the detained population suffered mental illness or vulnerability, does that increase the risk of desensitization and abuse?
Well, it seems to have in the relevant period. I think that seems like it would, because they are people with a lot of complex needs, and again, their needs that the officers can't necessarily respond to. The officers could respond to them in terms of having conversations and directing them to the medical care that's available and trying to sort of be with them as people. But the rate of officers relative to the number of people who are in a detention centre at any one time basically means that they don't really have that much time to actually have conversations with people.
And what about healthcare staff? Are they subject to desensitisation in the same way as the custodial staff? Did you see evidence of it?
I think that the evidence was a bit mixed about the healthcare staff. So certainly in the footage there absolutely were instances quite often of when healthcare staff responded, particularly to drug crises, where they absolutely did seem to be not just being professional but also being caring, and that they would speak respectfully to the person who had taken drugs and who was having some kind of, looked to me like a seizure. But then, we know that there were also healthcare staff involved in some of the restraints. So I think healthcare staff, it is obviously going to be part of their training, and it's also part of, I guess, the logic of the job. You go into healthcare because you want to help unwell people, and that's presumably part of your motivation about your job, and that's not really clear that would be part of why you become a DCO.
At 3:15 of your report, your first report, on page 15, you say, in my opinion, the evidence demonstrates that in 2017, Brook House was a low-trust environment in which staff didn't always treat detainees with dignity. They also did not always treat one another with respect. And if we fast forward, as it were, to 11:15, forgive me, on page 52, so it's the very last paragraph of your first report. To ensure that the events of 2017 don't recur, greater attention needs to be paid to the balance between care and security, to eradicating racist and sexist beliefs and language, and to develop a shared culture with the detained population that emphasises the dignity and decency of all. And in your second report, if you wouldn't mind flicking over to that at 1.3. On the second page, you say the new material I've been provided reaffirms the preliminary conclusions I made in my first report. That Brook House in 2017 was an institution that, notwithstanding efforts from individual staff members, was a low-trust, high-pressure environment that was neither sufficiently safe nor sufficiently caring, and that, as a result, the detained men were not always treated in an appropriate manner that recognised their inherent worth and dignity as human beings. Well, what do you think the link is, having reminded us of what you say there, what do you think the link is between staff desensitisation and the dehumanisation or othering of the detained population? In other words, the treatment by staff of detainees as worthless or just objects or less than human?
Well, I think if you are desensitised, so you are not appreciating the emotional distress that somebody is enduring, and you're kind of taking yourself in a way out of that emotional relationship with them because you don't want to feel that feeling, and you've kind of switched it off somehow. I think that then obviously leads itself to dehumanization. It obviously makes it more likely that you will not only not acknowledge their feelings or your feelings, but you actively then won't care about them. And so then, you know, I think, for instance, that the second example that I gave about the man who was screaming about, you know, what had happened to his immigration case and the fact that nobody spoke and nobody went to get anybody to resolve that question. I think that's a kind of example of what that looked like.
And it is dehumanisation, do you think, is that used as a way of staff avoiding responsibility for the consequences of their actions? I mean, if you're desensitised and therefore you behave in a dehumanising way, is that all part and parcel of when somebody misbehaves, a way of avoiding responsibility?
Avoiding responsibility. I mean, I think it just makes it hard for staff to recognise what they're doing, and I think and the effect of what they're doing, and I think then it definitely, I suppose, becomes part of their narrative about why they did what they did. You know, I acted in that way because I was desensitised, not because I'm a terrible person. So it can be used, I suppose, as a way of explaining to themselves things that perhaps they would otherwise be troubled by. I mean, I think what's interesting and again is probably worth acknowledging is that all staff, even those presumably who have been caught on film in this instance doing terrible things, all staff sometimes don't do terrible things, and so sometimes do recognise the person before them as being very distressed. And I think those, so I don't think it's an all or nothing thing. I don't think people become desensitised, therefore dehumanised, and never ever try and help somebody. I mean, I think there's and I think that is again one of the issues about this inquiry, is that because so much of it rests on this undercover footage, which was being taken for an important reason, we don't see very much of the other sort of everyday stuff.
No. Can we put up on the screen, Zainab, please, BHM 000045 at page 24, Chair, Supplementary Bundle, tab 6. And it's a statement of, can we just go back, please, Zainab? Sorry, my fault, to page 2. It's the statement of Dr. Brody Patterson, who tells us that he's an experienced practitioner, academic and researcher, registered mental health and learning disability nurse, fellow of the European Academic Nurses Association, honorary fellow ad Undem of the Faculty of Nursing and Midwifery, of the Royal College of Surgeons of Ireland, and he holds degrees and higher degrees in psychology, education, social policy, and published a number of papers. And he sets out further factors in his CV, as it were. Now can we go to page 24, paragraph 106, where he deals in this statement of his with the concept of dehumanization, which he says is more likely to happen more where the victim is already a member of a marginalized or stigmatized group, or where action is justified on the basis of the transgressions of that individual or group. As Arendt observed, labelling in some circumstances creates moral distance. This serves to render those affected by the label less than human, and thus undeserving of the natural human pity that might otherwise serve to prevent abuse. Unfortunately, there is little doubt that a series of narratives have served over time to distance or other asylum seekers from us. Of particular significance to the context of an IRC such as Brook House is a theme in the narrative distinguishing between genuine asylum seekers, i.e. those seeking refuge, and bogus asylum seekers framed as only entering the country for economic benefits and deserving of sanction and punishment. This narrative has gained prominence as a result of UK government policy since 2012, which has sought to create a hostile environment, the aim being to create a life so unbearable for undocumented migrants that they would voluntarily choose to leave as their access to public services becomes increasingly restricted. And on it goes. Did you agree with his view that there is a higher risk of a culture of dehumanization developing where the victim is a member of a marginalized or stigmatized group, in other words, foreign nationals facing removal?
Yes.
And how does the concept of dehumanization contribute, do you think, to the risk of mistreatment and abuse of detainees?
Well, I think it contributes to the risk of abuse because it simply means that people are not recognizing other people as being like them. So in the way you wouldn't yell at a stranger because you wouldn't want the stranger to yell at you. That doesn't seem to be the case always in the footage. So people seem to perhaps lose a sense that the people in their care were like them in a kind of fundamental way based on their shared humanity.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Professor Bosworth. Chair, it's almost but not quite half-past. Can I suggest we have our 15-minute break and return at about 22?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Professor, can you turn to your 4.11, please, on page 17 of your first report? And I'm asking you this on behalf of G4S. At 4.11, you note that officers on housing units could find their work boring and lacking in variety. And then if you turn over 2 pages to 4.19, you say placing the same officers on the housing units every day may help generate familiarity with those who are detained. The strategy also, in principle, allows staff to develop expertise and to take ownership of aspects of their job. However, on its own, consistency of staffing doesn't develop trust. And the question is, on balance, do you consider that some officers should work solely or primarily on housing units?
So I think I do think that. I think that in any detention centre there's a sort of balance that the management strikes between moving people around to help them learn new skills, to sort of probably try and prevent cliques and subcultures from arising. They have to balance that with consistency, because one of the biggest challenges for staff is that there are very few officers to quite large numbers of people who are detained, and the detention population changes frequently because of some people leave very quickly and other people stay for much longer. So I think having some consistency in the housing units probably is important. But I think it's also then a question about what you get the officers to do on the housing units. And one of the enduring aspects about Brook House, and forgive me, this is a longer answer than I think you're looking for, but anyway, one of the enduring aspects about Brook House is that the housing units, they have an office on the ground floor in the housing units, which is where the officers tend to sit. Until very recently, they didn't just sit inside an office with a door closed, but they actually sat, as you see in the footage, inside the office with the door closed behind a very tall counter. And when I went on the visit recently, Serco has actually removed that counter and has kind of got rid of that barrier, which I think is very, very good. But even so, I think, if you don't have very many members of staff, you have a very noisy and not particularly pleasant work environment. It's natural that people are going to want to sit in their office. And then that, in a way, destroys any kind of attempt that you might be hoping that they would make towards building relationships with the people on the housing unit. So I think, I think it is important to have consistency, but then the companies need to really be a lot clearer about what they think the staff should be doing on the housing units. And because security is so much part of the role, what they mainly do on housing units is they mainly do kind of room checks, what they call fabric checks, or they signpost the detained population to other services. They depending on the arrangement of the place, they maybe have to lock and unlock the door to let them in and out of the wing. But there's not really a kind of role for them that's made explicit about building relationships. And I think that appeared in the footage, that a lot of it is just quite mundane work, checking names off lists to make sure everybody's getting their lunch, stuff like that. So. And I'm sure the companies have put a lot of thought into this already, but I think trying to develop what the housing unit officer role is could perhaps be helpful. And because at the moment it often seems to be the case that the activity staff, which is what Callum Tully was, they have a job to kind of entertain and work with the detained population in leisure. The welfare staff's job is to help people. The people in the library's job is to sort of help them with documents and books and things. And healthcare staff obviously help with healthcare issues. The housing unit people, I'm not really sure what their additional work is other than kind of maintaining the good order and discipline and cleanliness of the housing unit.
Well, you mentioned cliques, and you deal with that at 4.29. Let's move on to that. You say interviews with Verita in 2018 suggest that during 2017, a small group of DCMs had encouraged a particular culture of machismo in Brook House, which had encouraged at least some of the unprofessional behaviour evident in the Panorama expose. It's hard to judge from the material submitted how widespread their views were at the time, since it's not possible to know what proportion of the officers appeared on film. And at 6.5, on page 31, you say in 2017 the evidence suggests that at least on E-Wing, the gap between the SMT and the DCOs was filled by a core group of DCMs who favoured an aggressive authoritarian style of management. And we can see what, for example, Owen Syred, who you mentioned earlier, the welfare officer, had to say about this kind of issue. If we can put up, please, on screen, VER 000252. And this is Owen Syred's interview with Verita in April 2018 at page 15. And Chair, it's tab 25 if you want a hard copy. At entry 234, he's asked the question, do you think there are still within the centre a few officers, perhaps a few managers as well, who are a bit macho and cliquey? We know some of these people, those people who left under Panorama. Do you think there are still some? At the moment, I don't think there are. I go down to E-Wing quite a bit, and I went there this morning. The guys around there I've worked with a long time. I know them. Their character, I know they've all got good hearts. The guys who worked down there before, I didn't go down there that much. E-Wing, yes. Most of the guys, apart from one, Charlie, I knew well. He was always very good with detainees. And pausing there, that's Charlie Francis, who there is evidence did speak to detainees in a particular way, which Dominic Aitken extracted from him when he interviewed him when Dr. Aitken was doing his research. One of them, Mr. Syred goes on to say, I actually had issue with, and I said to him myself, you're out of line, about an incident that happened. Of course, I wasn't too surprised, but you can understand when they're working in that environment down there, they become quite close. What goes on there stays there. That's their sort of attitude. I've worked down there myself. Question, you don't see an evident clique at the moment. I don't see an evident clique. Question, you see possibly some still macho behaviour or not? No, it's not as bad as it was. I used to be called Cuddly Care Bear by certain officers, and actually the officer who used to call me that got the sack. And he's asked a few more questions of that, and then Miss Lampard says, not in the group? Yes, I wasn't part of that clique. I wasn't part of the macho group. I'd overhear talk in this staff room about stuff people talk about, whatever. And on it goes. And then turning, please, if we may, to the Verita interview in March 2018 of Sarah Newland, which is VER 000223 at page 20, Chair, tab 21 if you want the hard copy reference. Page 20. We can go down, please. I think just a moment. Page 21. At the top, please. And 294. We're going to talk about this week, says Miss Lampard to her. There is one final question to pin this down, and maybe it wasn't about this, but I do see some of what you've been talking about reflected in the staff on the floor. One shouldn't make judgments about people's physical appearance, but it is unmissable that there is a cadre of DCMs who are testosterone-filled, large men who slap each other on the back, and as a woman, I'm acutely conscious of them. There they are. You don't have any female DCMs other than the two we know about. You have two DCMs, and they tend to be doing more strategic and admin functions. Do you think that's a fair assessment, that there is a laddish, small group of DCMs? Yes? Do you think that they are influential in terms of the culture of this place? They are. In fact, the last 2 or 3 occasions that I've done DCM interviews, so DCOs who want to be DCMs, when you ask them about making decisions, they talk about Oscar 1. One DCM on a day will be Oscar 1, so they are responsible for the running of the centre. They respond to incidents, they juggle staff around, and what we would try to extract from them is, think if you were a DCM and you needed some advice and support, whom you'd go to. We were trying to extract from them the duty director, and they kept going on about Oscar 1. And you reference in your second report, Professor Bosworth, at 4.15, 4.15, on page 20, and this was your second report in light of further information you received. The additional evidence that I have read confirms my findings in the preliminary report that there was dissatisfaction among the staff group, as in that report the witness statements to the inquiry suggest that there were also tensions among parts of the custodial staff group, and that these conflicts likely affected the treatment of the detained men, both because staff felt undervalued by and suspicious of their peers, and because the staff hierarchy in specific staff cliques and individuals discourage them from calling out problematic behaviour by colleagues. So all of that arrives at this question. What do you think are the likely explanations for the formation of dominant staff cliques within Brook House which perpetuated that macho, testosterone-filled culture?
Well, I think there were. I think the evidence does suggest that there were, that was that macho staff culture, and I think that there are a number of different contributing factors. And one of them returns us to this issue about the prisonization of detention. That the training and a lot of the language casts people who are detained as being potentially dangerous. And that invites a certain kind of masculine authoritarian response.
Self-perpetuating,
So it's
circular.
Yeah. I think that it is also, it seems to have been the case that because of the nature of E-Wing in terms of where it's located in the facility, because the SMT were not as visible as officers wanted, that there was a sense that they were somehow out of sight, and that therefore, things grew there that perhaps weren't really controlled, and by that I mean, the sort of authoritarian subculture. I think whenever I go into any IRC, staff always complain that they don't see the SMT. I don't think that was something that was just about Brook House, and I think actually the SMT have quite a distinctive role, and their role is not operational. In the sort of narrow sense, they are there to be strategic and to be producing reports and to be sort of having an overview. And so, they do spend a lot of time in their offices. They're managers. That's what managers do in any line of work. I think the other element, which is perhaps not so apparent, is that actually custodial work is quite feminized work. And so, they spend a lot of time doing things like stripping duvet covers off duvets because a new person is coming into the room because one person has been removed or released. They have to make sure everybody gets their lunch. They have to sort of help them perhaps maintain contact with their children. These are normally jobs that women do. And so the way I read it is that some of the performance of masculinity is actually a kind of compensation for that aspect of the job, and that it's much more exciting to think of yourself as being there in security, potentially dealing with somebody who might be dangerous and a threat, than it is to sort of tell yourself that your job is to, you know, clean up after them and basically do women's work.
Yeah.
So I think all of those factors contribute.
Thank you. If you go to your page 18 of your first reports, paragraph 4.13, let's pick up on another issue which you identify. You say, while some staff members described an esprit de corps with specific colleagues, a number of wing officers complained about the nature of their job, their low pay, and the conditions under which they worked. At times they complained about new colleagues. And we can see this, because you footnote it as well, but we can see this in a particular transcript. Let's just put it up. TRN 000021 at page 6. Chair, this is in the supplementary bundle at tab 7.
Thank you.
And this is on the 29th of April. Callum Tully, all of them are suspended down late because apparently he lost his rag with someone, and the new staff put an SIR in saying something was missed. And another officer, identified as male officer 2, got to be careful with the new staff. They give us something's missed, there's going to be no one here. Someone else says these new staff, yeah, and down late, bunch of cunts, ain't they? Literally are. So says Tully, that's 4 people in total have been suspended. And you reference that particular paragraph, that particular transcript on that day. And if we look a little further in your own report at 424 on page 19, we have another aspect of this. A number of staff members in the Verita interviews and the footage complained that too much attention was focused on new officers and not enough on those with long service. Inexperienced staff, people complained, made mistakes. They didn't have the life experience necessary for the job, some thought. As DCO Gary Siggins put it, for example, you can't teach experience to an ITC. We've lost so many top-notch officers, it's unbelievable. It's just bodies. Another DCO claimed on the footage, unless they know actually what the fuck they are doing. What's the impact, do you think, on the view of new officers, inexperienced, couldn't be trusted? What's the impact on, I mean, we've heard about difficulties of recruitment and retention, but you've got new officers come in who aren't trusted by the old guard. What's the impact of that on culture, do you think?
Well, I suppose it raises the risk that that if that the new recruits who would like to disrupt the old culture perhaps wouldn't stick around if they are going to not be treated very welcome in a sort of welcoming fashion by existing staff. I mean, I think there are again structural explanations for this which are not necessarily simply about culture, which relate to the lack of career progression for DCOs. And so, while a few DCOs become DCMs and then they receive a slightly enhanced salary, but not massively, most people stay DCOs for the duration of their career. And then the pay structure, as I understand it, is such that for the they're basically earning the same as somebody who's only just been recruited, and that seems to me to be an entirely reasonable frustration you might feel, and can, I would have thought, contribute to to a sort of hostility within the career structure. That if you feel as though you're just expendable to your senior management team because they're going to pay some new person the same amount as they've paid you, and they don't think you have anything to give them, then why would you give them anything?
Yeah.
So I think, you know,
so there were structural problems which I think you're telling us contributed perhaps to the view of new recruits. But in terms of the long-term employees who might have been part of a clique, what impact did that have on new recruits? I mean, either they put up or shut up, presumably.
Well, I mean, I can't say based on the evidence that I've seen what the effect was, but I mean, certainly from other pieces of research, you know, there's famous studies that have been done with the police, which document that, you know, before police officers begin their job, they quite often have, you know, quite liberal views. They quite often, you know, express concerns around questions of poverty and social justice as contributing to offending. You know, they might have a whole series of motivations for becoming a police officer, but normally after they're in the job as a police officer, their views change and they become the views of the dominant, more authoritarian, less sympathetic. So, you know, what I assume that's what happens in detention. But I mean, to be fair, we don't have the evidence.
No. As you appreciate, the inquiry's heard quite a bit that this toxic macho culture encouraged the use of inappropriate or derogatory language and glorified violence and use of force. Can we have a look at some parts of the evidence? If we can put up, please, Chair, supplementary volume for you, tab 8. VER 000257 at page 7, please. And this is Dominic Aitken's interview with Verita. At the top, at 48, one thing which I did hear a lot at the time, and which, having watched Panorama, I now feel I should have been asking more about. I heard an awful lot of staff say to me, there are some people that worked here that think it's all about fighting people and it's all about control and restraint, and they love that side of the job. And those are people that are here for the wrong reasons. What they were always saying is that a minority of staff, it's not me, and they would never name the person or the people that they had in mind, but a lot of different members of staff said that to me, suggesting that there is at least a minority of staff, it might be a very small minority of staff, who do that, who restrain detainees too easily, who enjoy the kind of conflict and bravado. When that idea, notion was put, I think, in my recollection at least, to all of the officers, former officers who came along, they denied it. And then Nathan Ward, who made two statements to the inquiry, but the first of which, Chair, at tab 9 of the supplementary bundle, DL 000141 at page 82, please. Paragraph 232 at the bottom. Here he was talking about, and we don't need to look through it all, and we've seen this before, how because the national group of trainers instructed the instructors who went down to local level, there was a sort of macho culture that cascaded down locally. And this is what he says at 232, the toxic masculine culture which filtered down to G4S was evident. I witnessed staff being trained in degrading ways, such as forcing them to dress up in boiler suits and helmets to do warm-ups with press-ups. If they made mistakes, I complained about the CNR training to Wayne Debnan and Ben Saunders at the time, as I felt it was inappropriate, humiliating, and set the wrong culture for the centre. They stopped the warm-up practices for a certain period of time. I complained about the CNR training more than anything, as I saw it as being central to the running of Brook House, which to my mind was wrong and perpetuated a negative, macho, aggressive culture. So we've got Dominic Aitken, who picked up on the fact that some people just thought it was all about fighting and actually enjoyed it. You've got Nathan Ward here complaining about the nature of the training which perpetuated a macho, aggressive culture, as he puts it. What in your view, is the impact of that? So when you we've talked about a different aspect, and you said earlier there are different cultures here, but when we're thinking about cliques and when we're thinking about machismo and that testosterone-filled environment, what impact does the formalisation of training, which perpetuates that kind of training, that kind of culture, have, and what Dominic Aitken picked up on when he was doing his research during the relevant period?
Well, I mean, I think that I know I noted in the reports that the training then and indeed still now seems to really emphasize security, and pardon me, you see that in the number of days set aside for various CNR techniques, and also sort of subsidiary kinds of security related techniques around searching and one thing or another like that. And I think what that does is it builds up the job as being a job that is dangerous and risky and requires a certain kind of form of authoritarianism and indeed masculinity. I think that the difficulty is it actually mostly the job is not like that. And again, here we do need to be a little bit careful about the footage, because the footage suggests that Brook House was always like that there were always these crises and always this control and restraint. But you know, I'm sure even in I would imagine that even in the relevant period it wasn't like that all the time. And certainly when I spend time in IRCs, I don't that often witness that sort of behaviour. So I think that, I think it's a story people tell themselves about what their job involves, and it's a story that's a lot more interesting than actually a job is going to be ticking people's names off a lunch list. Yeah. And it encourages a particular form of masculinity, which in this case seems to have generated all sorts of problematic behaviour. But it's, it returns to this question about what exactly is the role of a DCO, and how could we try and cast that in terms that are not security related, or not only security related.
Callum Tully, if we can just put up his inquiry statement, INQ 000052, at page 43, please. And Chair, you've got this in your supplementary bundle at tab 10. Paragraph 169. Furthermore, it's clear from the evidence that I amassed during my employment at Brook House that although the abuse of detainees was consistent throughout my time there, the staff members responsible for that abuse changed over time. Some abusive members of staff left Brook House only for others to continue the abuse. This, in my view, demonstrated that the abuse of Brook House wasn't because of a few bad apples operating unbeknown to others, but because of a cultural, he says systematic, I suspect he meant systemic, failings which gave rise to this behaviour, allowed it to go unchallenged, and dissuaded members of staff from raising concerns about it. Detainees suffered as a consequence. What do you make of that, fresh blood comes in and adopts the culture that's already there? On the one hand, we were talking a little earlier about new recruits being mistrusted, and Callum Tully's take on new recruits is that perhaps not all of them, but some would come in and just carry on where others had left off. How does that work?
Well, I think that was what I was referring to about the academic research on police. Is I think that is how behaviour is perpetuated in institutions. So while it is the case that individuals bear responsibility for their own actions, it is also the case that if there are certain ways of doing things, then new employees learn those ways of doing things, and so I suppose there's a question: what would have happened if in Brook House they'd done a P&O and sacked everybody and replaced them all in one go? Would that have made a very different institution? Probably not.
So that suggests that Brook House itself, structurally, environmentally, impacts on the culture.
Well, I think so. I mean, I think this is really the point I'm trying to make about if you build an institution like High Security Prison and you fill it with foreign nationals for the purpose of their removal, I think as Stephen Shaw wrote about Oakington all those years ago, you are kind of setting up a system where this sort of behaviour is always going to be a risk. And it's not to say that everybody's doing it, of course not, but there does seem to be a sort of repetition of things happening over a fairly long period of time in different institutions. It is part of the system, I think.
Let's go back to Dr. Patterson. Chair, this was in your supplementary bundle at tab 6B HM 000045 at page 22, please. And if we go to paragraph 97, page 22, 97, such language, attitudes and behaviours are clear evidence of a corrupted or toxic culture, irrespective of the original root cause of the misuse of coercive measures. If such misuse is sustained over time, such patterns of behaviour can gradually become embedded as part of the service culture subtly passed on to new members of staff via modelling, rather than explicit endorsement as simply the way things have always been done around here. The problem is not one of bad apples, it's of a rotten barrel. Do you agree with that?
I do, but I also do think that, again, we need to be careful to remember that not everybody acted in the way that this group of staff that we're talking about did, and I think we do need to have an explanation for the fact that there were people, like Owen Syred in welfare. Yeah. And so, I mean, I think that it's clear that there are systemic factors involved, but there are also individuals who are somehow able to resist those factors.
So do we understand, looking at the last line of that paragraph, you subscribe to the fact that there were several bad apples, you don't subscribe to the fact that it was a rotten barrel?
No. I mean, I think it's not helpful to think about bad apples because, I mean, I think if you think about bad apples, then you would simply say, well, we just would get in some new people and then we wouldn't have any problems, and that's clearly not the case. But I suppose to maintain the metaphor, even if there's a rotten barrel, there are still some people who act with good intentions and who try and help and make a difference, yeah. And that's all I'm trying to keep in mind.
Thank you. And while we have his statement open, if we can go to the next page, at paragraph 101, in the first couple of lines, the misuse of restraint. He says, whether in the form of notionally approved techniques or various forms of violence, has been suggested to be a defining characteristic of a corrupted culture. Do you have any views on that?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of the footage and things, it's not simply this question of misuse of restraint. It's the issue of the overuse of restraint, the kind of relying on restraint as the way of handling vulnerable and distressed people, rather than alternatives which would have involved, lots and lots of talking, but also bringing them the information and the things that they needed. So it's not simply, I mean, certainly there seems to have been misuse of restraint, but I don't think that's the only issue. It was that there was a reliance on it.
And if we change the word to overuse rather than misuse, do you agree with him?
Yes.
Whether in the form of notionally approved techniques or various forms of violence has been suggested to be a defining characteristic of a corrupted culture. You
yes.
do. And then his paragraph 104 on page 24, where he says the saturating effect of such cultures, once developed, may become so powerful that they redefine what staff would ordinarily interpret as abuse, if not criminal behaviour, as mere conformity. Newly appointed staff can come under significant implicit and sometimes explicit pressure, not only to accept the inappropriate behaviour of other staff, but to themselves engage in institutionally sanctioned violence in order to be accepted and trusted. Do you agree with that?
I mean, it seems like a reasonable proposition. I suppose I don't have a very clear sense of the scale of beyond the footage of the restraints that were used. And so, I mean, one of the things I think that the events in Brook House really make very clear is the importance of having transparent, reliable information about what's actually happening.
Yeah. He refers in the previous paragraph, I didn't read it in, but in paragraph 101, to the Anpashali incident and provided some views about that. Do you think that or that the impact of that kind of corrupted culture, if that's what it is that abusive behaviour can or does become normalised and is no longer seen as unacceptable?
I feel like I'm being slightly pedantic, but I mean, normalised, do we have the evidence that it was normalised across the entire establishment, that everybody thought it was fine? I mean, I'm not sure we have that evidence. I mean, clearly Callum Tully didn't think it was.
No.
So I mean, it does seem to be from the footage that there was a lot of there was normalisations, particularly in the coarse language that was used and the ways in which detained people were referred to disparagingly. There does seem to be a sort of have been a normalised way of dismissing the detained people, and that would lend itself towards instances of violence and abuse, because they're no longer kind of considered to be fully human or fully sort of deserving of decent treatment. But I mean, the footage, as far as I'm aware, did not necessarily show multiple other incidents that were quite of that nature.
No, no, you're right about that. So one, I mean, your point is you have to be slightly careful because the footage could be limiting.
Well, I mean, yes, I suppose that the question from the footage is simply is a question of how do we understand this specific set of events that happened in a specific period of time. How do we sort of extrapolate from that to try and understand the whole institution? And I'm not trying to say the whole institution didn't have problems. I think there's a huge amount of evidence that it did, and I am of the view that a lot of the problems are a consequence of the nature of the system as a whole. But I mean, I also suppose I think it's important not to sort of imagine that everybody was constantly trying to strangle distressed men.
Which brings me to the issue of silence. I mean, one of the issues with D1527 is one could take the view, and it'd be a matter for the chair if she does, that was completely covered up, the incident that we are talking about. But she may take the view, I don't know, that it was covered up not just by custodial officers but also healthcare.
Yeah.
Do you agree that a key feature of Brook House staff culture was the bullying, marginalisation and targeting of officers as snitches who sought to resist or speak out? Do you see evidence of that?
Well, I think you see evidence of that in those quotes before about views of new recruits and people putting in security incident reports. And so that does provide an example of that sort of discussion. Again, I am a bit limited by the amount of footage because I don't know how widespread that was, but certainly the officers who repeatedly appear in the footage seem to have taken that view.
I mean, looking at other examples, we've got Owen Syred. We don't have to look at it. The inquiry has seen it often, but in his one of his inquiry witness statements for the record INN 000007, his paragraphs 125 to 127, you may remember this, when he complained about the use of the N-word by another staff member, was subject to a campaign of ostracism and was referred to as a nigger lover, which you will have read. Callum Tully, for his part, in his inquiry statement, we looked at it a little earlier, but paragraph 168 of INQ 000052, he tells us that the culture of silence across the workforce of Brook House, coupled with the lack of demonstrable oversight, interest and engagement from Ben Saunders and his senior management team, allowed the abusive culture in Brook House to fester and go unchecked. He adds the confidence that officers and managers had to, in front of other members of staff, flagrantly brag and joke about abuse, or speak in derogatory or even racist terms about detainees, demonstrated their faith in the culture of silence which allowed the abuse to persist. And we've also got his evidence, you'll remember, which is also found in his witness statement and in his evidence, of a poster or posters, speak out posters, which were in the staff area outside some lavatories, as I recall it, were defaced with snitch, grass, that sort of thing. How does all of that feed in to how officers go about their job? How does it feed into how they feel comfortable about reporting others when they see misconduct taking place?
Yeah, no, I mean it seems fairly clear from the evidence that this was not an environment where people were encouraged to report their concerns, and it seems to have been an environment where there was an extensive normalization of inappropriate ways of talking about people and acting towards the detained population. I think that raises questions again about the nature of the role. Like how would you what would you need to put in place to sort of allow DCOs to build confidence that they could report things? And I mean, there's either did they recognise that it was wrong, and maybe they didn't even recognise that was wrong if they themselves believed in these sorts of views. But it also, I think, speaks to the way in which there was clearly a lack of trust among officers. So there wasn't, in the same way that they didn't trust the detained population, that they sort of saw the detained population as a threat, and I think Callum Tully refers to it as an us and them. There also wasn't a kind of widespread series of relationships among the staff, which perhaps could have encouraged them to talk about concerns they had about each other.
Yeah. I mean, you spoke in your report at 4:20, we don't have to look at it, that there appears to have been a subculture or a distinctive subculture on E-Wing. What do you mean when you use the word subculture? What are you trying to depict? Are you saying that there was a dominant culture, or it's a different culture, or it's only exclusive to those who come and go on E-Wing? How do we understand that?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of the statements about E-Wing seem to suggest that E-Wing was considered to be a very particular part of the centre, and that it had these very dominant, aggressive members of staff working there, and that a lot of the people who worked on E-Wing appear, a lot of the footage was in E-Wing, and a lot of the people who appear in the footage were officers from E-Wing. So that was really all I was trying to get at, because I suppose, there's a question about would we have seen different kinds of actions if the footage had been, mainly done in a different unit.
Yeah, it looked at a different way. Do you think there's any significance to the fact that some of the most severe abuse, which you will have seen depicted on the footage, occurred on E-Wing in relation to the most vulnerable residents in Brook House?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think what you see in that is you see an institutional and an individual failure to understand the detained men as being vulnerable, and instead they are considered to be dangerous and difficult, and that in a way justified for the officers their actions. That their actions kind of are all of a piece, where instead of seeing these men as vulnerable and having mental health problems and therefore in need of help, once they're on E-Wing, they seem to be considered to be difficult.
Yeah. Let's turn on then to one of the other issues that you have been asked to consider, language.
Mm-hmm.
And did you agree that within this staff culture, inappropriate, derogatory, offensive, racist language about and towards detainees appeared to you, from what you saw, subject to the qualifications you make about the footage, commonplace?
Yes.
Not just confined to specific cliques insofar as you could tell, or specific officers?
All of the officers swore all the time. I mean, it was very extensive.
I mean, we've heard evidence from former staff members that this type of language was used either as a form of banter between officers. It was in effect private and not intended to be heard by detained men, or as a way to cope or let off steam. And similar things have also been said about language with detained people. And so, for example, some of the worst examples, we have oral evidence of Sean Sayers, "I'm going to skull fuck you like the little bitch you are," said to a detained person on the 10th of March. Language, he said, may seem inappropriate, but it was banter, and that the detained person was laughing as well. Did that make it consensual, do you think?
No.
Or there's the allegation, albeit denied by John Connolly, and he, after all, had been at Brook House for years, and he was one of the CNR instructors that he called, and this is according to Callum Tully, which it's right for me to point out John Connolly denied when I asked him about it, but nonetheless called a detained man a cunt during a strip search, according to Callum Tully. I mean, is there anything that you can help us with as to how consent works, or probably doesn't work, in the context of a custodial environment and where there is a clear associated power imbalance?
So you mean the claim that this is banter?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
banter, and you know, my point to you was, could it ever be consensual, even if the detained man found himself laughing at being abused? Is there a real consent
No.
in that situation where there is a clear power imbalance?
No, obviously not.
And we also heard evidence as to how language was used by staff as a means of fitting in with the macho culture. And let's maybe just put this one up on screen. It's a hearing transcript. Chair, it's in your supplementary bundle at tab 14. INQ 000164 at page 31. And I don't know if you had the opportunity. Sorry, it may be 161. It's 161, it's my fault, not 164. It's my handwriting. And if we go to page 31 at the bottom, you'll see the individual pages 1, 2, 4. If we scroll down bottom right, and this was the evidence of Calvin Sanders. And he had made, you'll remember, maybe you won't, but he had made certain comments to Callum Tully on the 4th and the 8th of May about certain things he said that he had done to D1527 when he was on constant observations of him on the 24th of April, the day before the Jan Pashali incident. And what he says at the bottom of 124 at line 20 is what the note says and what the truth is. You know, the comments I made to the DCOs were just my attempts trying to fit in. Of course, what the notes don't say is that the conversation before what I said was all led up to the recent CNRs that everyone had done. Being new there, and so he's interesting from 2 points of view, because he's saying, I'm new, and I'm trying to fit in. Now, you know, he claims that all of the things he alleged to have said to Callum Tully was just lies, it was make-believe, but he did it purely to fit in as a new boy, as it were. Being new there, obviously, you know, I was just trying to sort of fabricate some story in which, you know, it would make me seem more interesting to them, you know, being on a constant was the only sort of time that would. It's close to anything that they had done, you know. And then further down into page 126, individual page 126, at line 12, you know, these are just lies that I made up to try and fit in with some people who weren't even like great people, you know. And then on the next page 127, top right, at line 17, and this was my question to him. When you said, as we saw with the transcript we have up on screen, from lines 39 to the bottom, this is the 8th of May one, about being an attention-seeking little prick, because this is what he said to Callum Tully. He said that a reference to 1527 was an attention-seeking little prick. I asked him, was that your view, or was that something you made up as well? And he said, something I made up. Again, I don't feel like that at all, because, you know, my brother has killed himself, you know, from suicide. So that's not my view at all. Again, it's just me acting the way everyone else was. It wasn't just me who, like, said those things, because everyone else was saying it. And what do you make of all of that?
So actually, I'm struck by the fact that he references that his own brother had taken his life. And, I mean, I would... So to return to this idea of secondary trauma, one of the things that the literature on secondary trauma says is that people who have themselves experienced trauma, such as one's brother killing himself, they are more like they will have fewer resources to manage other people's trauma. So that, you know, in the kind of current terminology, they're more likely to be triggered by somebody else's trauma, and that when that happens, they are more likely to then be unable to handle it and to, you know, dehumanize and do all the sorts of things that secondary trauma causes. So to return to this account of what the prison service is doing around secondary trauma, one of the things they do with officers is that they try and get the officers to be mindful of what their own experiences have been in their lives, so that when confronted with somebody, you know, a prisoner who has various traumatic things that have happened to them, that they are kind of aware that that will actually affect them emotionally. So it seems to me that could well have happened with this man. It also seems as though, you know, he said and did lots of terrible things, and to say he was just trying to fit in is a little bit denying his responsibility for that. But if cultures reproduce themselves by people adopting the language and behaviours, that's what he's showing is happening. So
that we're clear, and it may just be me. If you have suffered the sort of trauma that he told us about, are you saying it's more likely he would do as he did? In other words, try to fit in by, maybe that the chair doesn't accept that he made up the stories, but let's assume that what he said was truthful and accurate. Is it more likely somebody like him would make up stories to fit in, or less likely?
I can't speak to the making up stories bit. What I'm saying is that if he's experienced the trauma he would be more likely to have quite an emotional reaction to somebody else doing it, yeah. And that emotional reaction in a place like Brook House would be a painful one, and that might make it hard to act appropriately. Yeah. So I mean, I think that it's not irrelevant that he had that kind of trauma.
I mean, attention-seeking, manipulative behaviour, swinging the lead, whatever you care to call it, is something a number of officers had in mind about the vulnerable population.
Yeah, and I think that's a very common way that people talk about people who self-harm and take their own lives. And I think that is both an indication of people's of the people who say it, is both an indication of, you know, their lack of humanity in that moment. Obviously, they shouldn't be saying those things, but it also, I think, does. We should accept that it's an indication of the kind of emotional consequences of witnessing that sort of pain.
I mean, other examples that we've had, back to Dan Small. We'll all remember this, and we don't have to look at the transcript for it. He said that the job has made me racist. You'll remember that. He said in his oral evidence to us, again, I'm not going to put up the transcript on screen, but he said the environment moulded you. It changes a person working in that environment. he added, "I've cottoned on." You remember he'd use those words in a different context. "I've cottoned on. Think of it as a sheep in a herd. You know, I'm just following suit. What everyone else did, just use the terminology that was used." So that's pretty similar to what Calvin Sanders had told us. And then we've got Charlie Francis, who, when he gave evidence, said he was led into it by more dominant staff members. In other words, language, use of language. He was led by that behaviour. He didn't instigate it. It was all part of the macho culture. Do you think, I know what you've told us about Calvin Saunders, and perhaps we have to be slightly more careful in his instance, given his experience. But do you think that claims that the type of language that we have witnessed was used to cope, fit in, has to be approached with a certain degree of scepticism?
So I thought I was very struck by the fact that Dan Small said that he'd become racist from working in Brook House, because I have published an article where the title of the article is a quote from a detention officer in a different institution saying, "Working in this place has made me racist." So I think that that's actually something people say. And I think that we can interpret that in ways that don't relieve them of their moral responsibility for expressing racist views. So I think that it seems to me that there's a lot of evidence that certain ways of talking about detained people and acting towards detained people were clearly encouraged by a group of officers in Brook House at the time, and that those ways of talking and acting were derogatory and often racist. But I think the fact that but I think that these are structural things that spring from the institution itself. So it's both a kind of question of attitude and belief, but it also speaks to the purpose of the institution. And that's why, you have the Stephen Shaw report from Oakington, written in 2005 or whenever, which finds very, very similar issues. Yeah. And that's the real challenge about trying to prevent it from happening again. I'm not sure that answered your question.
Yeah, I think it probably does, but thank you. Yeah, and the more staff witness or use this kind of language and do nothing about it, do you think the more inured to its impact they become?
Yes.
We've also heard evidence about the demeaning language used about or to detainees, often highly vulnerable people. For example, on the 25th of April to D1527, you'll remember, "You fucking piece of shit." D728 on the 6th of July, I think this was, and I hope I'm not misidentifying it, I think this was Ed Fiddy, said to Callum Tully, "He's been an absolute cunt." And of D1275 on the 14th of June, who had been removed to his room after a spice attack. We have Nathan Ring mocking him and his singing, calling him a div and a scrotum. What impact does that kind of language, it may be low level, some of it, not all of it, but what kind of impact does that type of language, do you think, have on the attitude towards and care of vulnerable detainees and their perception of their position within the IRC?
I think it's obviously completely corrosive, and it was, the widespread nature of those sorts of comments that are picked up on the undercover footage is genuinely shocking, and it clearly was not being addressed by management, and was widespread, and I think played quite a large role in the physical. Do you think
I'm sorry to interrupt. Do you think it contributes to the us and them?
Absolutely.
And the use of the language, or the freedom, perhaps, with which the language was used with impunity, did you think that has any contribution to the culture of mistreatment or abuse that we know existed?
Yes.
We touched on language barriers a little earlier. But what impact do you think that language barriers and difficulties some detainees faced had on their vulnerability to mistreatment and abuse from staff.
Well, I mean, I think the obvious effects would simply be that it would have been very difficult for them to seek out any redress or any assistance if they were unable to communicate easily. And I think one of the real difficulties that detained people face in detention is that it is quite hard for them to access help. And although there are formal complaints procedures, they require them to write it down, and they require them to write it down in English. And they require them to write it down in English for somebody who they're not really sure who they are. So I think all of that makes it very, very hard.
I mean, you spoke earlier about phone translating services. Should interpreters be used more frequently within, human interpreters?
Absolutely.
Within the IRCs?
Absolutely. I mean, I understand that Serco tries to overcome some of these issues with technology. So there are kiosks, which I think a lot of stuff is available in multiple languages. But I mean, the levels of literacy are low, and because the levels of trust are low, I think speaking to somebody on the other end of a phone who you're not really sure who they are is just totally inadequate.
I'm asked to ask you a few questions on behalf of G4S. If you go to your first report at 717, please. 7.17. On page 36, you say, more broadly as noted already, the footage shows a completely unacceptable level of swearing among staff. The language they use is coarse and aggressive, often sexist, and sometimes racist or homophobic. They not only swear about the detained men, referring to them among themselves as cunts, twats and fuckers, they swear at them directly, and then you give an example. And G4S invite me to ask you what you noticed about the level of swearing among detainees. In other words, directed towards one another and to staff.
I don't really think that's particularly relevant for explaining the staff behaviour. So, I mean, an analogy would be if you were in a school playground and teenagers are swearing at each other, you still wouldn't accept a teacher swearing at the children. So, I mean, in terms of the power differentials between the populations, it doesn't really matter if the detained people were swearing at each other or even if they were swearing at the officers. The officers' role is a professional one, and they simply should not have used the language they did.
Well, G4S asked me to ask you whether, in light of your criticisms of the amount of staff swearing, how would you expect staff to respond to being the target of significant swearing by detainees?
I'm sure that is very difficult, and I'm sure, I'm sure that it is a very difficult job, and I'm sure it's very unpleasant being sworn at and yelled at by people who are frustrated and more importantly, people who actually you don't really have any way of assisting them because they're frustrated about their immigration case. But it still seems to me that in a professional setting, all the staff could do was simply respond calmly, and so they just should never swear back.
A question I'm asked to ask is whether the national and racial makeup of the staff population, the majority being white British, where the detainees are self-evidently not British and almost certainly a majority are not white, does that create or risk creating an us and them cultural divide?
I think that's a very difficult question to answer because I think you, sorry to be an academic, but I think you really would like some evidence. You'd need some evidence to answer that question. It seems on its face that yes, it would be, you might risk having more problems of racism in an institution where there's a massive distinction between officers and the detained population. However, in the research that I've done using a staff survey, using a detainee survey called Measuring the Quality of Life in Detention, and actually also in HMIP reports, the institution which always scores the highest is Dungavel, which is in Scotland, which is entirely staffed by, or more or less entirely staffed by, not only by white Scottish people, but white Scottish people who are more or less from the same village. And in that institution, the gap between the staff and the detained people doesn't lead to this sort of behaviour. So yes, I think there should be a more diverse staff complement, but it won't in itself fix the problem.
Well, you found it difficult to answer the first question, but the lead-up or follow-up question is, does it lead or risk leading to the risk, therefore, of institutionalised racism? I suppose you'll probably say, I can't answer that, or maybe you can, I don't know.
Well, I think it seems to me that, partly what we're talking about in the inquiry is a form of institutionalised racism. So, I think there's lots of contributing factors to it.
So not just the us and them, which you found difficult, but what are the sort of factors that you think, therefore, make up the reason why an institution, an establishment like Brook House does suffer institutionalised racism?
Well, I think the purpose of it. Is, this is also what Stephen Shaw said in his report on Oakington, is that if you make these institutions which are designed to expel foreigners, then and you do it in a kind of legal and social environment where there's a lot of talk about how foreigners are a big problem, then I think that you run the risk of creating an institutionally racist institution, no matter the fact that many people who work in it would not espouse racist views and would not be motivated by that, and we always have to remember those people. I think the very purpose of creating prison-like institutions to remove foreigners raises that risk.
I mean, you presumably have in mind what Stephen Shaw said in the Oakington report, which is INQ 000109. We don't have to put it up. It's at page 4. Makes it a breeding ground for racist or abusive practice. Is that what you had in mind?
Yeah, I think it runs that risk, and I think that then what I guess what we then need to do is to try and understand some of the distinctions between the different centres and all the rest of it. But yes, I think that fundamentally that's the danger. Yeah,
what he said was that the very purpose of immigration detention, together with wider effects of hostile environment, makes it a breeding ground for racist stroke abusive practice. What do you think can be done to avoid it? There's the $64,000 question.
Well, I really think that the problem rests in the custodial environment. I think that the vast majority of people who have exhausted their right to remain are actually not locked up in prison-like institutions. In fact, we handle them through reporting requirements and other alternatives to detention. And I think that really is the solution. And I think that you could actually, I've said this in the report, and I know it's outside the terms of reference, but one of the things that the pandemic showed is that you don't need to lock people up. During the height of the pandemic, I think there were 400 people in detention. So there could be a concerted effort to actually handle people quite differently. And I think that would go a long way.
Yeah, the inquiry has to work on the terms of reference, as you recognise, and can only make recommendations within those terms of reference. So let's imagine the Brook houses of this world remain, and men are detained there in the sort of numbers that we saw during the relevant period, and that their racial makeup is of the kind that we saw during the relevant period. What's going to mitigate or avoid the effects of institutionalised racism in those institutions?
Okay, so I think there are things that could be done, and I think that they would largely. There's a whole laundry list of things that you could do. One thing that really needs to be done more of, I think, is to have these centres be much more transparent and much more open. So there is a way, in a kind of bigger version of what seems to have happened on E-Wing, there's a way in which these places are out of sight. And I know they have monitors who go in, but they are still very difficult for people to get access to the everyday workings of these establishments. And I think that is a mistake, and that there should be much more engagement with not just civil society groups, but academics, visitors, whatever. I think they could be much more open. I also do think that there are, maybe this is almost definitely outside the terms of reference, but I think thinking about policies that would reduce the size of the population would be very important, and the most obvious one for that is actually to introduce a time limit, because that tends to reduce the size of the population. Brook House currently has far fewer people in it, and when we went on our visit it was very quiet and there were lots of officers and they were being very helpful to the men who we saw. And then I think, you know, there needs to be a lot more effort made to try and facilitate people in detention availing themselves of their legal rights, and that means, you know, much better access to lawyers and to sort of legal advice. I mean, they would be the starting issues.
At your 8.7 in your first report at page 39, you say that centre staff appear to label young black men as potential security threats, whereas older Asian men were not. Do you think that might have led to the risk that young black detainees were more vulnerable to unjustified or excessive use of force interventions?
I mean, it did seem to have in the relevant period. I mean, it was very noticeable in the actual BBC Panorama show that there was I think a very regrettable attempt to cast some, even by the television show, to cast some of the people in detention as difficult and dangerous, and then others as, you know, deserving, more educated people, and that was quite racialized. So, and I think those logics, I mean, I've seen those logics exist in other detention centres. That
and then we have John Connolly, of course. You will well remember the the clip that was, I think, shown on the Panorama programme. We've seen it and listened to it more than once here, where John Connolly, the man I spoke to you about earlier, who, according to Callum Tully, during a strip search, had called a detained man a cunt, which he denied. But there we have, on the 17th of May, when a detainee, D275, is protesting on the netting, advising Callum Tully, when Callum Tully is asking him about a figure of 4, which is a kind of hold. Just say, "Listen here, nigger, listen to me," and one of the other officers laughs. "Do what you are told, nigger." And then a little later on, in a subsequent clip, Connolly says if he fucks up everything, he's getting, something's missed, so watch his fucking mash him up in the corner. You can't find a rabbit in a corner. If we fuck up, he'll fucking split, the fucker. And then we've got to push him down with a stick on the side, and a little later I want to fucking shove him down. Here was, as I described him earlier, a man who had been at Brook House for many years, a CNR instructor, respected, in his middle years, allieding racism with the use of illegitimate force on a man who ultimately was taken off the netting by the National Tactical Response Group, who had to come in. What do you make of all of that?
Yeah, I mean, it was an extremely violent way of thinking about his job and the man in question, and it definitely, I think, shows entirely inappropriate views and suggests that there was a potential for, you know, entirely inappropriate practices, and that it does show the connection between racism and violence.
Yeah. A little further on the same day, because these officers, including Connolly, were on this stairwell for some time. We know, if we look at the footage, that there was a point in time where the Imam, Mr. Khayyam, came down to speak to Connolly and some of the others, and then he leaves. And when he leaves, Connolly is heard to say, "Massage my arse now, right now that cunt's gone. Just forget figure 4, go straight into locks. Right now that cunt's gone. What will happen is the Nationals will be behind you, they'll come up on that end." As I say, that's what he was saying about an imam who worked within the establishment and someone that Connolly knew. Do you think it's significant that John Connolly used that kind of language to describe an Asian member of staff, as well as racist language to describe the protesting detainee in the same event?
Yes.
And why do you think it's significant?
Well, I mean, it shows that he held racist views, and also the fact that he was in a position of authority and he trained, the staff below him suggests at any rate that he would have been communicating those views to other people, and nobody challenged him. And I mean, it does show a kind of he obviously didn't think that there would be any consequences.
No. But does it, do you think, show, as it were, a pervasiveness whereby if an instructor uses words like that and ideas about what's going to happen during a use of force to much more junior officers, some of whom are fairly new, that itself perpetuates that kind of macho, aggressive, racist culture?
I think that would be the risk. And
Yeah.
I mean, in the evidence, was it the Verita evidence? I know at Tinsley House, the hibiscus workers complained that when they had some use of force training, I think it was a different officer,
Yeah.
that officer had used inappropriate language, and they did complain, and that was part of the record. But I mean, that was precisely their concern.
Yeah.
Actually.
And let me remind you what I told you about Owen Syret before, who sometime before had complained and was about racist language, and was called a nigger lover and was ostracised and himself harassed. What does it say to you that kind of language apparently was never sanctioned, even after a complaint was made?
Well, it suggests that the senior management team were not doing what they were meant to be doing.
Chair, it's 1 o'clock. Lunchtime. 2 o'clock,
Thank you.
please.
2 o'clock. Thank you.